Welcome to Dr. Osborne's Zone. Today is a special show in the sense that that I've turned 50 years old, and so we're celebrating 50 years. And I thought I would change it up just a little bit for you. Usually we talk predominantly about health-related topics and nutrition, and we'll still talk a little bit about that today. But I wanted to talk about just some of my life experiences and the lessons that those experiences gave me, and hopefully maybe some stories out of tonight that you can glean from and hopefully garner some value from. So welcome. Thanks for joining me. You unlock this door with the key of compassion. Beyond it is another world, a world of science, a world of common sense, a world of sanity. You're moving into a land of both empathy and ethics, of nutritional knowledge and empowerment. You've just crossed over to Dr. Osborne's Zone. So nothing works better to educate us, I think, than the School of Hard Knocks. Going through life, we all have our ups and downs, but probably the biggest lessons, it's true for me, the biggest lessons I've ever experienced were the ones that that really put you in your low points, and hopefully in those low points you look up and see a way out and can get out of it and learn a lesson. But I can remember a time before I went to graduate school. This was shortly after I got out of the Air Force, and so I was a young man in the grocery industry. I actually worked for the chain Kroger, for those of you who may be familiar with them. And I was a grocery manager at Kroger for a number of years as a job on the tail end of my service in the U.S. Air Force. And so I was working long hours, 60-plus hour weeks. I was working terrible hours, weekends, holidays, you name it. And it was one holiday. It was a Thanksgiving. I can remember it very distinctly because I was working on Thanksgiving. My family was at home. I wasn't with them. And the store was packed because, as you know, everybody needs the last-minute Thanksgiving groceries. And so here I was, my boss directly above me. So the job that I was vying for, if I put in enough time, effort, energy, and hard work, and here I am looking at my boss thinking, wow, if I get the next promotion, I'll still be working on Thanksgiving. And so that, to me, was an epiphany moment, because what I realized at that point in time is I could keep going, and I could probably have a career in grocery management, or I could make a massive change in my life. And I decided to make a massive change. As a matter of fact, that moment was so moving for me. I just remember looking up at my boss as we were talking, thinking, this is me in 10, maybe 15 years, still here, working a holiday weekend, and under huge amounts of stress. And it was just not a future that I wanted for myself. And, I made the decision at that moment I was going to go back to school. So the very next day, I turned in my 2-week notice. And turned in my 2-week notice, registered for school, and I went back to school full time using my GI Bill, which, for those of you who aren't familiar, that's a college credit that you get when you go into the armed forces. So I actually funded my undergrad schooling with the GI Bill. It paid for about 1.5 years worth of school for me. So what did I learn from that? I mean, looking back, it's easy to pick the lessons, but one thing I learned was sometimes you have to have the courage to walk away from what you have in order to grow. And so hindsight's 20/20. At the time, I was just ready to be done with that particular position. I didn't exactly know what I wanted to do. So my future wasn't cast in stone by any means, but I knew that if I didn't take the risk and go back to college, then my life would virtually have been a multitude of years working holidays, working long hours, for little reward and little gratitude. So it was easy for me to leave, and it was easy for me to walk away from a good paying salary as well. But I also learned that money can't buy happiness, because although I had a good salary there, I wasn't happy. And so it wasn't until I became impoverished, you could say, as a student, where I was actually able to find what made me happy. And that leads me to, what I found, which is anatomy, physiology, and nutrition and biochemistry. Those were all classes that I took in undergrad that really sparked my interest in moving forward into the realm of nutrition. And it's why I do what I do today. So making that decision to walk away from a grocery manager position with a good salary and a good income to become a poor student for the next 7 years was it was a risky proposition, but I'm very, very grateful that I was steered in the direction of making that decision. And so, years of graduate school, fast forward, one of the things that I was blessed to be able to do in my career, post-grocery store, post-Air Force, was rotating through hospital environments. And so one of the hospitals I actually got to work in was the VA hospital. And I worked in the rheumatology department. Many of you have heard me talk about this, but as I was in the VA hospital, I was a guest, you could say. I was a guest graduate student rotating with other doctors. Most of them were medical doctors. I was really the only other non-medical doctor as a chiropractor. And so going through that rotation, I learned a lot of valuable lessons. And so the first day of this rotation, I was given a book and told not to come back unless I read the book. So I go home and I read the book through the weekend and take copious notes and come back the following week for this rotation. And I'm just a quiet student sitting in the back of the room, really just observing. I've read the book, I did what they asked me to do, and I want to just kind of sit back, not make much commentary or waves, and just see what they're doing. And so I was just, again, an observer. And as I observed what they were doing, one of the things I came to the realization of is that they were not doing much of what I read in the book, and which shocked me a little bit because I was told to read the book. And so you would think if they want you to read it, they want you to glean the knowledge from it and potentially, take value in it and apply it. But they weren't applying the methodologies from the book. And what did I learn? I mean, basically I learned that there were 4 triggers for autoimmune disease. And again, rheumatology is autoimmunity. It's a form or a category of autoimmune conditions that cause, musculoskeletal damage through immune attack. And so 4 triggers: food, chemicals, microbial imbalance, and nutritional deficits were the 4 primary medically verifiably documented causes and triggers of autoimmune disease. And so I was taken aback because in the hospital setting, doctors weren't measuring for those triggers. Everybody who came through, whether they got a diagnosis of RA, rheumatoid arthritis, or lupus, or ankylosing spondylitis, or psoriatic arthritis, it didn't matter what the diagnosis was. They all got the same set of medications. I mean, it was either methotrexate, steroids, nonsteroidal anti-inflammatories, and a few people might have gotten hydroxychloroquine or Plaquenil, some of the other types of pain-reducing drugs, but nobody ever got testing to try to determine what was the grouping of triggers in their particular case. And that was what really took me aback, because I was told to read the book had the information in it. So when I started to ask questions, one of the first questions I asked is, why aren't we testing these patients for these potential triggers? And I was told that that's not necessary. And I said, I don't agree. Why would all of the people that wrote this book, and this, you understand what this book was? This was a book written by, close to 50 plus different doctors who were experts in the field of rheumatology and research, and they're all saying these things. And so why aren't we doing what these experts are saying? It didn't make sense to me. Why would they write the book if we're not going to follow it? And so I think I was somewhat dismissed because I was just a green new doctor who didn't know anything, and I was just trying to rock the boat. But it didn't stop me. I brought pages of research articles, actually stacks of research articles, to the attending and said, look, why don't we take some of these people aside and do some diet change? I mean, gluten is one of the primary known causes of autoimmune disease, and there's a lot of research linking gluten to rheumatoid arthritis. What would it hurt to take a few patients aside and have them change their diet? So I was told no. So I went to the medical library, and one of the lessons in this all is that I really learned how to learn at this time. As a student in graduate training, you're usually told what to do, what to read, what to study for, and what topics that you have to take in order to obtain a degree. And and all those things being important, but to me what was more important was that the summation of all the classes and all the college that I had gone through, it didn't deter me from wanting to continue to learn. And I think this is a mistake a lot of doctors make, is they get their degree and their learning is done. Now they become a robot writing scripts, and that was not something that that I certainly wanted to have as part of my methodology, but I wanted to keep learning. So anyway, I went to the medical library because I was collecting research at this point on triggers for autoimmune disease and what we could actually do in these patients. And so I brought back stacks of research on gluten, stacks of research on fasting, how fasting could cause alleviation of autoimmune pain within 48 hours. And then I brought back research on how you could use omega-3, high-dose omega-3 fish oil just as an effective of a pain reliever at the right doses as a non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drug. So each time I brought back a stack of research, I was told that we weren't going to implement any of these things. And what it really served to do is it taught me one thing. It taught me that you cannot change a system that is corrupt. And that was something that I did see there. I saw a lot of drug reps coming in, a lot of drug reps pawning their ware, and there was a lot of influence that these reps had over these doctors. I saw a lot of surgeons coming across our floor every week. The surgeons would come in and they would get paid to do the surgeries because at a point in autoimmune arthritis, people's joints are still destroyed, their joints are still failing them, and then they end up getting replacement joint surgeries. And so I saw that the pharmaceutical companies were making a lot of money. The surgeons, through surgeries, were making their fair share, but the patients were getting screwed. And that was not something that I could really stand by and be quiet about, which is why I kept doing research and kept asking questions. But I think the biggest lesson that I learned was in that environment was I learned that my learning wasn't over, and that just because I'd gone through the vast majority of schooling didn't mean I couldn't learn more, and that's what I committed myself to doing in the VA hospital. But one of the other things that I learned is that don't just accept things because that's the way that they are. And I think so many people do that. They come into an environment where the work is done this way because the work is done this way, and nobody ever questions the efficiency or the efficacy of why the work is done in such a way. And so it continues to be done ineffectively and inefficiently and poorly. And so don't ever be scared to ask questions about the status quo. And I learned that in the VA hospital, even though it was met with great resistance and really with scathing commentary. Nonetheless, I still met it, and I think that's where anyone in their life has to have the courage to stand up for what is right, regardless of the consequences. I think, if anything, we've seen that really true in the last couple of years. But beside the point, one of the other things that I learned in that environment was that the people in positions of authority are not always correct. Here we have people in places of authority. My attending doctor, it was a person in a place of major authority and was going to sign off on my rotation or not sign off on my rotation. But it did, again, just because they had an opinion that was different than mine didn't make their opinion more correct than my own. And actually, I went on after that rotation and went on to start a private practice. And one of my first patients in private practice was a 9-year-old who had juvenile rheumatoid arthritis, and she was diagnosed from the age of 2. So from the age of 2 to the age of 9, this little girl was put on methotrexate, which is a very powerful anti-cancer medication used to treat pain in people that have joint arthritis of an autoimmune nature. And so for 7 years, this little girl was medicated, and her pain was still not well controlled. She was in and out of the hospital so frequently for pain medicine that they embedded a port in her arm, a permanent one. And so by the time she was brought to me, her mother brought her into me. Why? Because the rheumatologist looked at her mother and said, "Your daughter's going to die. She's maybe got 6 months. You need to get your affairs in order and prepare for this." So these doctors drugged up this little girl for 7 years. They didn't measure the 4 triggers, right? Just like the doctors at the VA hospital refused to do. These private practice rheumatologists didn't measure them either. And they just shot from the hip with the prescription pad, right? So here this little girl is with a terminal diagnosis. She's going to die. And fortunately, her mother brought her in to see me, and one of the first things we did with this little girl was we measured those 4 triggers, those 4 categories, and what we found, the 2 predominant things in this little girl was, number 1, she was gluten sensitive, and number 2, she was allergic to blueberries, which she was drinking smoothies, blueberry smoothies heavily every morning. Her mom would make her one because, it's the common perception that blueberries are a superfood, but for this little girl, they were a poison. And so at any rate, we changed her diet, and within 6 months, we were able to get the permanently embedded port out of her arm, and within 12 months, she was in total remission. And that's a story that because I challenged the status quo, because I learned how to learn and I learned how to go above and beyond what others were willing to do, I was able to garner knowledge that could actually save a life. And that, to me, that was an extremely valuable lesson, because what it taught me was you don't come to the culmination of knowledge in school. School is the beginning. School sets a requirement of base knowledge, meaning that everybody with this degree has a baseline of this amount of knowledge, but your learning is really just beginning. And so many people become stagnant in their life once they get their diploma, whether it's, whether in my case, like a doctorate, or whether it's a bachelor's or a master's or a PhD. A lot of people quit their learning once they get that diploma and hang it up on the wall. And I think that's a huge mistake, because it doesn't just stifle their success. One of the other things I've learned is that when you quit growing as a person, you begin mourning, right? So the lack of growth equals the mourning, and I mean mourning as in sadness, as in mourning your potential, your lost potential. So for me, learning has been an ongoing endeavor always, and I think that's one of the reasons why I'm happy. I think that's one of the reasons why I'm not depressed. So many people in their lives and their careers get depressed because they quit learning and they quit growing, even in their respective fields. And so don't ever forget that staying sharp means continuing an education, not stopping at a certain point and saying, I've reached the pinnacle of who I'm ever going to be. Because when you start mourning yourself, that leads to dark roads. That can lead to depression and a number of other psychological conditions. So the VA taught me a lot of lessons, but I think the most valuable lesson that I learned was stay tenacious. Just because somebody tells you no, you don't have to accept no as the answer. And so it was me not accepting no as an answer that allowed me that really focused me, laser focused me to go out and start my own practice. And had I not done that, who's to say I wouldn't have worked in a hospital setting or in a group setting where I was stifled and handcuffed and being told no all the time, and then I would never have met you wonderful folks and been able to deliver this message that I'm giving you today. I think I also can say I learned a lot of lessons in my private practice. When I started my practice, I was a broke man. Imagine going through years of school after leaving again, a relatively lucrative management position, to going into student loan debt to be able to finance moving yourself through the education process. And so coming out of school, most doctors today are anywhere from $300,000 to $500,000 in debt as a result of, if they take out student loans, if they don't have the finances to afford their school. And I was no different. I outside of the GI Bill that I had, it was a small amount of money, about $11,000 in total. So it didn't pay for much college. The rest of it came from the combination of working 2 to 3 jobs and student loans to boot. So one of the lessons there was that hard work pays off. I graduated with less student loan debt than the vast majority of my classmates, because the vast majority of my classmates didn't have jobs as they were going through graduate school where I did. So to me, that hard work paid off in a big way in terms of the creating the amount of debt. And one of the ways that benefited me was when I got out ready to start a private practice, I had debt, but it wasn't such a monumental amount that that banks wouldn't look at me and take a risk. And so, you know, when you're starting a practice, you've got to finance a building and construction of the rooms and the layout of that building, and you've got to finance the equipment, and you've got to finance having employees, some people to answer the phone for you, and so there was a lot that went into starting a practice and more debt, right? So on top of the debt I already had, I actually incurred even more debt in doing that. But I think that one of the biggest lessons was that I was preparing for it the entire time. So there's this old cliche. I remember when I was a kid, one time I opened a fortune cookie, a gluten-containing fortune cookie, at a Chinese food place. And the fortune inside, you open it up, it says, chance favors the prepared, or luck favors the prepared. And I took that because it always stuck with me, that silly fortune cookie wrapper. And actually, I was 16 at the time, so I put it in my review mirror in my car, so that anytime I flipped the mirror down to fix my hair, I would see that chance favors the prepared. And so it just drilled into me that prepare for the future, think about preparing. A lot of people just kind of float through life and don't prepare. But starting that practice took a lot of preparation, and so I was preparing for years. I was buying used equipment and trying to finance that practice by working multiple jobs and going through school, so that by the time I was ready to open it, I was ready to open it. And so again, it saved me a lot of money because I was preparing the whole time. So don't forget the importance of preparing for your future. And then I learned so many lessons through practice, just working with patients. And so I'll share a story with you. I had one particular patient, his name was RP. And it was a day like no other, because it was one of those days you remember for several reasons. One, it was storming outside. So here I was in my relatively new practice. So this guy was one of my first new patients in a new practice, and it was one of those days where your whole schedule, as meager as it is when you're brand new in practice, you're not running a super busy. I wasn't running a super busy practice at the time because I was brand new in it and still building it. But my whole day got canceled because the storm that blew through town that day was just tremendously horrid. I mean, it was shutting out lights and flooding the streets. And so I had one patient show up that day. His name was RP. And RP was, he was a middle-aged man. He had tremendous back pain. He had blood sugars well over the 300s. And he was coming to me for my nutritional advice, and I did everything I could to help him. And so we spent this day, he'd come in, again, we got stuck in the storm in the practice. So he shows up early, he was my first patient in the morning. He shows up, the storm is coming at this point. He's now stuck in my practice. He can't leave because the streets are flooding. And anyway, so it's just him and I. We're there together, twiddling our thumbs. So I'm like, let's make a go of it. Let's give this guy as much education as we can possibly pour into him, because we're both stuck here. What else are we going to do? And remember, this is before cell phones. So you didn't have that as a distraction or an obstacle to to avoid communicating, as so many people do today. But anyway, I poured into this guy for a good 6 hours, and we talked about the nutrition around blood sugar. We talked about diet change. We talked about exercise. I showed him what he could do. Like, we did so much. And that was the last time I ever saw RP that day. I think he'd gotten his fair share of me after 6 hours of grilling him with trying to just pour into him and give him knowledge. But the lesson I learned from that experience, and I'm glad I learned it early, because I've done a lot of charity work in my life trying to help people who were less fortunate. But one of the things I learned, and the Bible talks of this too, is don't cast pearls before swine. And it's not that RP was swine, it's just that his mind wasn't open to wanting to receive the information that I was wanting to pour into him. And so some people in your life don't want to hear it. You know, how many people do you know that that don't want to change their diet? And you know, if they would just change their diet, their lives could be infinitely better and less painful. Some people don't want to hear it. And so when you spend, you know, inordinate amounts of time trying to educate somebody who's not open to it, I think you really, one, you're hurting the relationship, because even though they may be kind enough to not say anything to you, they are basically resenting you for all the things that you're saying. And two, I think you're wasting your time, and you have time is such a valuable resource. It's another lesson I've learned, is that time is the only non-renewable resource, and it's so precious. And so, you know, when you pour in and you spend your time pouring into somebody to try to help them, and they're not really ready or willing to accept the lesson, I think it's a waste of time, and it's a disservice to you as a person, spending your time to try to help that individual. So, you know, don't spend your time trying to convince the closed mind. So other lessons I've learned in practice a number of years ago, you know, laws change, and sometimes unfairly so. And my background as a chiropractor, one of the procedures I used to perform was something called manipulation under anesthesia, which is where a person was they were too bottlenecked or too tight, their muscles were too tense, and you couldn't give them any treatment because they would just reflexively tighten up, and so it would hurt them more than it would help them. And so one of the types of treatment that I was trained to do was something called manipulation under anesthesia, which is where you in a surgical center, you have an anesthesiologist put your patient in a twilight where they can fully relax. And so once they're fully relaxed, you can actually do a manipulation on them that helps to resolve their issue. And so this procedure was a perfectly legal procedure until it wasn't. One day, the medical board in my state of Texas, you know, went to court, and they sued the chiropractic board and basically changed the law overnight, taking away that right for chiropractors in my state to perform that procedure. So, you know, one day it was perfectly legal, the next day it wasn't. So over the course of about a year and a half later, I get a letter from the state board in my state, the chiropractic boards. You know, they were basically accusing me of practicing medicine without a license. And the reason they were accusing me is because there was an old web page on my practice website that made mention of manipulation under anesthesia. I wasn't performing them anymore. Once it became illegal, of course, we were all notified to cease and desist that particular procedure. But I had I'd left some information up on my website about that procedure, and so the board comes after me with the rage. I can't believe how aggressive they came after me for that, just having that page up on my website. And so they accused me of practicing medicine without a license. Again, this goes back to the lesson, which is don't ever be scared to protect your reputation. It's the most valuable thing that you have, and it takes decades to build and moments to destroy potentially. And so this board was coming after me and accusing me of something that I'd never done. And so, you know, what do? You hire an attorney and you fight it. And that's what I did. I ended up having to hire an attorney and fight it. And, you know, about, you know, $30,000 in attorney fees later, I was still unsuccessful, but kind of successful. So it was one of those situations like many in court where nobody really wins. The board ended up fining me $2,500 for having a segment on my website that talked about a procedure that I hadn't performed in over a year and a half since the law changed. But the whole premise of me even fighting it was I was trying to protect my reputation. And so we ended up negotiating some things with the board, and even still today, that mark is still against my reputation. But I was not afraid to fight it, And that's the point. And then years later, we ran into a similar scenario, although not board related, where this was just a couple of years ago, where Business Insider, the magazine Business Insider, did a hit piece on me. The title of their article was Doctor Recommends Lethal Doses of Vitamins for COVID. And then they went on to write their article, and it was about me and a couple of other doctors. And anyway, it was wrong and it was misquoted, and they didn't get their story straight, so we ended up having to threaten to sue them so that they would change their article. They actually ended up changing it, but because we threatened to sue them, so again, your reputation is very important. It's important to protect. Don't be scared to expend resources in an effort to protect it, because in my opinion, it's super precious. And when you allow somebody to basically tarnish your name, that can be extremely detrimental. So sometimes it's the bad things that teach you the great lessons. Some other things I've learned in practice about other people. So if we're talking about reputation, is don't judge a person solely on their past. On their past, which is currently that is their reputation, right? So many people come to me and they're sick, and if I spent a lot of time judging them on why they became sick in the first place, I wouldn't be very effective as a communicator, a healer, or somebody in a position to really help them, because judging them before you've had an opportunity to understand them is a mistake. And so although we all do judge, and I think judgment is important, I don't think that observation is prejudice, but I think it's important to hold judgment. I think there's only one entity that can judge you, and that's the Lord. So obviously try not to judge others before you've had an opportunity to understand them. And that's something that practice really taught me, because so many people, even yet today, come in and they've got, multiple diagnoses, multiple forms of autoimmune disease, multiple health issues, and they're very, very sick. And so you've got to give them the benefit of the doubt. The whole premise of why they're there today is that they're there looking and seeking repentance, in a sense, and repentance for their health, right? They're looking to make a change. They know they need to make one, and they're looking to make that change. And so think about that, how people may come to you at times in your life, and sometimes it's especially in this very bipolar, argumentative world that we live in today. It's very polarized and very charged, and so it sometimes can be very easy to judge somebody, or judge what they're saying, or judge what they're doing hastily, without giving an opportunity for dialogue to open up. So very important. I think another story I'll share with you, another really good lesson. When I founded, this was just prior 2010. It was the end of 2010 is when I founded GlutenFree Society. And as we were building out the website and writing articles and content for the site to educate people, I got a email from a young man whose mother was upset with me. Who were talking at this time, this is going back 12 years now, talking about corn gluten 12 years ago, and how corn gluten is damaging and detrimental for people who have celiac disease, and here's the research to prove it. And so I had this one woman coming back at me, and she was very upset, very angry, because she was accusing me of taking away her corn. Right, and I'm like, I'm not telling you not to eat corn. I'm just telling you, if you eat corn and you have celiac disease, there's an opportunity that you might become inflamed and not get better. Take that for what you will, but it's not me telling you what to do. And anyway, this woman just continued to berate me and continued to really harass me, and it was an online harassment more than anything else. So I just kind of deleted her and moved on. As sometimes you have to do that, because it's another lesson I learned, is sometimes people just aren't right in the head, and judgment or not, you're not going to fix somebody who's really disturbed, who's not willing to be open to being helped. And so sometimes you just have to move away from people like that. And anyway, that's what I did. But a few weeks later, I get this email, and it's got a link to a YouTube video. And so it's from this woman's son, and so he goes on in this email to berate me and say, you're a terrible person, and then he says, I made a video just for you, and it's a YouTube video, so I clicked on it, watched it, probably shouldn't have, but anyway, he goes on scathing and wishing that I would die in a fiery car crash. I mean, this guy was pretty much a Looney Tunes for making that kind of a threat. But anyway, my point is, don't waste your time debating or trying to defend your position with emotionally charged or unstable people. And I spent a lot of time early on as we were writing articles and creating blog material to help people. I spent a lot of time defending that premise to people who hated us for trying to help them. In essence, a lot of these folks were in the celiac community, and they felt like their diets were already restrictive enough, and that the information we were providing was onerous and overwhelming. And I think that was the gist of it, is they were just taking that out on me. And I spent a lot of time in debate trying to be argumentative with them or trying to help them see the light. But what I realized very quickly is it was an utter waste of time. And going back to the lesson that I should have learned better from RP, a story I shared with you earlier, is that don't cast pearls before swine. And so don't engage with people who aren't willing to be engaged with. You're wasting your time and your energy, and you're only going to serve to elevate your blood pressure and create a bad day for yourself. So that was, I think, a pretty important lesson for me. Now I don't read much commentary on any of the writings that I have, because I don't really, honestly, I don't really want to take in the negativity. And there's a lot of people out there that are just, trolls wanting to be negative. So you've got to watch out for those folks. I also learned, founding GlutenFree Society, that the more I actually did help people, the greater the reward, and the reward came in multiple ways. So for me, it was the greatest reward were the letters that people would write me that would proclaim that the information that we were publishing was life-changing and life-saving. I mean, I've got thousands of letters and emails and commentary from people who I never met in my life, that whose lives were completely turned around and changed simply as a result of some of the articles and videos that we were creating. So that really, what that told me was that you don't cast your pearls before swine, but you do put information out there so that people can access it, because if it's available and somebody is searching for it, they can find it, and it can change their life. And so that's actually where Save 100 Million Lives came from. It was the lives that we were saving and changing, my team and I, that we had never met these people. These were not people that came to see me in my clinic. These were people that were complete strangers. And so those people really fueled and drove forward my desire to get more and more information out to help people. And so that reward is nothing in my life that has been more rewarding professionally, not privately, but professionally, than being a part of this community, and really just providing knowledge and information that people could take and use and really have their lives changed and affected in a positive way. I also learned one of the first endeavors when we were first creating a line of supplements. My background, so part of my background in graduate school and graduate training was pharmacology, in the sense that I studied drug interactions with nutrients. So drug-induced nutrient deficiencies is a passionate project. I had years ago. I had one of the largest databases in the world on drug-induced nutritional deficiencies with different drugs and the mechanism of action and how they cause nutrient deficiencies. And so from that knowledge base, what we were trying to do is bridge the gap. Part of our early mission was, how do we get doctors involved in this mission? Because I also believe that teaching people how to change their lives is important, but teaching doctors how to help teach people to transform their lives could be even more potentially powerful. So one of the first things we did early on, because I was trying to bridge the gap between medicine and alternative medicine. So I come more from the alternative realm, you know, the standard medical doctor, obviously more of a traditional realm, more prone and apt to write prescription drugs to mask symptoms, and less prone to ask why the symptoms exist in the first place. Again, differences of philosophy, not a judgment, but we were trying to bridge that gap. How could we bring more medical doctors on board understanding nutrition? And so I spent years lecturing nationally to doctors everywhere on drug-induced nutritional deficiencies, and again collected some of the largest research database in the world on the topic. And so ultimately we developed a line, an internal medicine doctor who I partnered with. Again, we were trying to bridge that gap together. We developed a line of supplements for patients, for doctors to prescribe their patients. And so this line of supplements was designed to offset nutritional deficiencies caused by drugs. And so we had a product or a supplement for women who were taking birth control or estrogen-based therapies, because estrogens cause B vitamin deficiencies, magnesium deficiency, among others. And so I had designed and developed a product for women taking birth control. We developed a product for people taking pain medications, and we developed a product for people on blood pressure medicine and cholesterol medicine and diabetic medicine. So we had these different products, and anyway, the whole process of doing that, which took a number of years and substantial resources financially and time-wise, failed completely. It was one of my first very, very big failures. And I say that because sometimes success is failure, right? So if you learn to recognize why something failed, then you can take that lesson and you can become more successful in the future. And so I learned that, here's what I learned. One, I learned that people that wanted to take drugs didn't want to take supplements. Doctors that prescribed drugs didn't want to prescribe supplements. And most people won't take a product for its prevention qualities, especially if they're okay with medicine. So we were trying to target people who were taking medicine, who were okay with taking medicine, who didn't really want to have anything to do with nutrition. And so it was just a mismatch. It's just a product and an information gap that people didn't care enough to want to know that the drug they were taking could actually cause the problem. And the doctors, we couldn't convince enough of them to want to come on board. So it was a miserable failure in terms of what we're trying to accomplish in helping people. But what it allowed me to do was focus more on, understanding that, if you want to help people, you have to meet them where they're at. You can't have them you can't try to make them bridge a gap that they're not willing or even capable of bridging at those moments in their life. So that project we ended up scrapping, but again, super valuable because of all the research that went into it, of all the years and knowledge that was garnered from it. Today, I would say I'm a leading authority on drug-induced nutritional deficiencies, and so can help a lot of people in that way when they're ready to receive that help. But again, it allowed me to learn that failures can be a success as long as you don't let the failure define your future. And so picking yourself back up and moving forward, learning from the lesson is very, very important in life. And so that was an example that GlutenFree Society and creating it really helped teach me. On marriage and relationships, I think we've probably anyone watching this has had a fair share of relationships, maybe even before marriage. Not everybody marries their high school sweetheart. I certainly didn't. But I could share some things that maybe you already know and maybe not, but some things that I have learned over the years in my relationships, particularly in marriage, is number one, your spouse is probably the most important decision you'll ever make in your life, who you choose. I know because I've chosen poorly, and I've also chosen very fantastically. So, in relationships, so, there are certain categories of things that I would encourage any of you, if you're of the age where you're not married, or maybe of the age where you are thinking about marriage, is thinking about asking yourself what are deal breakers in terms of that relationship. They're what I call the 4 primary deal breakers of any relationship. Number 1 is if you disagree with your significant other on how you spend money and how you save money. That is a very dangerous ground to get into. It's very important that you think the same and behave the same around dollars and cents. Number 2, politics, especially in today's world, as charged as people are, whether it doesn't matter what side of the fence you're on, that in my experience, in my opinion, that you should largely agree on where you stand with your partner in politics. And number 3 is religion. You can't have opposing religious dichotomies. Oftentimes those become deal breakers when people start having children, and then there's arguments on how you're going to raise those children and in what church or what religious aspect you're going to raise them. Ethics, moral values, etc., all very important. And then, for people like us, if you're entrenched in the health world, it's your viewpoint on health. I have seen a lot of relationships be destroyed over gluten. As a matter of fact, one story I can share with you is a young woman, and her husband came to see me, and they had 5 children, and 2 of their children had epileptic seizure disease. And we actually had come to the conclusion that their seizures were actually being triggered by gluten, which is a common neurological manifestation of gluten, is epileptic seizure. A lot of people don't realize that, but we found this to be true in these children. And so anyway, the family went gluten-free. And what ultimately ended up happening is initially Dad was on board and he was very happy with it because the kids weren't having seizures anymore and they didn't need medicine. But ultimately the dad got tired of the diet, and so he started pushing back, not on me, but on his wife. And so anyway, he got to the point where he no longer wanted to tailor or cater to the diet at all. And he filed for a divorce and divorced his wife over gluten, if you could imagine. And I'm sure there were more things than just gluten behind that relationship, but kind of where I came into the story was I'm called into the courtroom because what happened is as they were divorced, the kids were now sharing custody, and so they would spend time with the mother and the father separately. And every time they go to their father's, he would feed them gluten, and then they would end up in the hospital with seizures, and then mom would have to deal with the medical consequences of that. And so she ultimately was extremely frustrated with him. You could imagine if you were, her mother, or if you were the mother in that situation. And so anyway, she ends up pulling her ex-husband back in court, and that's where I got a phone call to be expert testimony on the stand. And so they draw me into this court case, which I don't like to do. I don't like to get into people's business in that way, but I felt like for the kids, it was definitely the right thing to do. So the judge asked me, in your opinion, are these kids having seizures as a result of being exposed to gluten? And it's pretty easy. I said, yeah, in my opinion, that's exactly what's happening. We have a historical medical record that is what happens, and here it is. And so the judge fortunately ruled in favor of the mom and enforced that when the kids are at Dad's house, they have to be gluten-free. Now, how that turned out, I don't know. I'm sure they had their episodes of heated arguments and debates. But point being, they didn't see eye to eye on health. They didn't see eye to eye on diet. And I think if you're going to be in a relationship with somebody, you have to see eye to eye, whether it's on one side of the aisle or whether it's on the other or whether it's somewhere in the middle. Because if you don't, it's going to become a nagging fest for somebody in that relationship, and it just won't last. And so those, in my experience and in my opinion, if you can agree on those 4 things, on politics, on money, on religion, and on health, I think you can build a strong and solid relationship. I've also learned in relationships that it's better to give than receive, but sometimes you have to be open to receiving in order to grow. And I think, you know, one of the things a lot of people have a hard time doing is receiving, especially when it comes to receiving compliments. I know I'm somewhat guilty of that myself, and I've had to really work on it. But in order to grow in humility, it's good to learn how to receive, and in a relationship, it becomes very important. I've also learned that men and women complete each other. Men, in my experience, were chaotic, angry, strong, and motivated to go out into the world and make a presence and you know, make our place known and you know, climb our mountain and plant our flag. And those are great things. I'm not saying those are bad things. I'm not going to be one that preaches toxic masculinity. I think that's nonsense. I think men and women are just different. I think whereas men are that way, women are more heart-centered. They're more. We'll just say a lot of people accuse women of being very emotional in their way they have their thought process, but I would argue that most women think very deeply and very longly about many, many things. And so it's that skill set that, when connected with the right man, is like a perfect union or a perfect marriage of characteristics that can create a very, very powerful force in the world for good. And so when I say men and women complete each other, that's what I mean by that. I think in relationships that lack of communication is probably the number one reason for fighting. When one person's not communicating well to the other, or one person's not listening well to the other, communication has to become you know, a major piece of the relationship if you want it to last and weather the test of time. I think a wife needs her husband's strength. That doesn't mean that I think that women are weak. I think that women are very strong, and never underestimate just how strong they can be. But I also think they're fragile in other ways. And I think women are strong emotionally and mentally, and I think men are strong physically and not quite as strong emotionally. So I think a wife needs her husband's strength, and I think a woman needs I should say a husband needs his wife's heart, and a woman needs her husband's strength. I would say you got to have a sense of humor in relationships. Your wife is always right is another thing, guys. If you're watching, that's a good a good one to live by. I could say sometimes writing poems for your wife is the right thing to do to make things all right. And ultimately, I would say that in life, love really, in my experience, is the answer to a lot of grief and a lot of problems. And so having somebody that you can go through the world with, that you love and care about deeply, is very, very important to complete yourself. On parenting, you know, I've got 3 sons. They're all, you know, one passed away, many of you know, of a rare type of cancer 4 years ago, and that was tough. Really tough to lose a child. And but you know, part of parenting, I think, for me, in my experience, is that you have a lot of wonderful things that happen with parenting too. I mean, you get to see the world vicariously through the eyes of your child, of your children, as they grow, and that's an amazing, just wonderful thing to participate in. And I think people that don't experience that, I wish that everyone could experience that, because in my experience, it's just so wonderful. I think that children have a lot to teach people. You know, one is that life gets messy, you know, so learn to embrace messiness, especially if you have children. I think children teach us humility. Children teach us curiosity again. As adults, I know especially this was true of me as I got older and serious. You know, you lose sight of that child sometimes within you, that inner child. And I think having children really can help you tap back into that very important aspect of yourself and of your personality. I think that children, oftentimes, what they do, parents take either too much credit for, or parents too much blame on either side of the equation. I think ultimately, when they're kids, it's important that we mold them and teach them. It's important that we give them the freedom to also make decisions and make mistakes. Because if we rule over them, with an iron fist, they can't learn, and we can't learn, right? We can't learn and grow with them. And I think it's important that you understand that this has just been my experience, that when your kids are successful, don't take credit for their success, and when your children aren't successful, don't necessarily beat yourself up for their lack of success. Just be there for them and be happy with them when they are successful, and be there to help pick them up when they're not. But don't take credit either way, because at the end of the day, they are autonomous in their choice making, even when they're younger. If you've ever raised children and you've ever had a stubborn 12 or 13-year-old, you know that by the time they start going through puberty, they've got a mind of their own, and they're going to make and take actions on their own, despite all your best teachings and all your wisdom that you try to impart on them. And I think at the end of the day, with kids and parenting, I think love is the answer there too, because you just have to love them for who they are, even if they're not like you. And sometimes your kids won't be like you. What are the lessons from the past few years? The past couple of years have really taught the world a lot of different lessons. One really big lesson is that the road to hell is paved with good intention. If you look at all the wonderful intentions, it doesn't matter, I don't care how you're political, what side of the aisle you're on politically, or what side of the face mask argument you're on, or what side of the vaccine argument you're on, it doesn't matter. I'm not here to debate that. I'm just simply make the observation that lots of people had really good intentions going through the last 2 years, and the outcome of those intentions has been horrific on humankind for multiple reasons. We've got lockdowns that have financially ruined, decade-old family businesses. We've got lockdowns that have polarized people against each other and pitted neighbor against neighbor. We've got, plenty of familial arguments over masks and vaccines, and so we've got this dichotomy there. And all of this came out of, I think, good intention. The leaders were trying to lead, only I think we could probably all agree they did a horrendous job. Going back to what I was talking about earlier, is that people in positions of authority are not always right. And it's very important that, one of the lessons I think that everybody walk away from this is very important to understand that people in charge don't know any better than you. They're not more qualified to make the decisions about you. They're not there to come and save you. They're not going to ever come and save you. And what they're trying to coerce you or have you do is not necessarily the best thing for you to do. And so at the end of the day, what matters more than anything else is individual freedom and autonomy. And I learned that lesson too in the Air Force. When I spent time overseas in the first Desert Storm, I witnessed some pretty horrific things. And one of the things I witnessed was a culture that was very demeaning to women. It was a culture that was even very demeaning, largely in my experience, to some of the men. And in a culture that didn't have, let's just say, due process of law. And so if you've ever witnessed a public murder of somebody who may or may not have been guilty and certainly didn't have a fair trial, that's a hell of a thing to witness, and it sticks with you. And one of the lessons I took in my early 20s was people in positions of authority should be put there voluntarily and shouldn't have authoritarian basis over you. And I think we saw a lot of that in these last 2 years. We saw an authoritarian aspect of our governments really trying to manhandle us and take away our freedoms in the name of safety. And I think if we could learn anything, it's that autonomy and ability to make decisions about our own health is important. And again, no matter what your decisions are, if they're different than mine, then I would respect your decision to make your choice, and I would hope the same back from you. It's not my job to protect you. It's not your job to protect me, not really. Now, we do live in a society, and so we may come together with some agreeances and protect each other in an agreeable way, but it's not my job, and it's not your job, and so we shouldn't look at each other in that light and hate each other for having opposing opinions. And I think that's what happened. That's exactly what happened over the last couple of years. I think we could all have learned that don't debate emotionally charged people. I mean, I had made that mistake a number of times. I was very angry the first many months of this whole thing after after the news came out and censored me, and after we were under intense investigation for doing nothing other than making a recommendation of vitamin D. You can't fight people who aren't willing to see eye to eye with you, and it's not worth your time. So going back to don't cast pearls before swine. Don't argue with emotionally charged people either. It's a waste of time. I've learned over the past 2 years that forgiving is easier than hating someone or hating somebody's ideology more than anything else. It's easier to be forgiving and try to be understanding, but just not try to engage. And so that to me, that keeping that distance has been a godsend. I've also learned that moral superiority is not a virtue. It's easier to criticize something than it is to solve a problem. And I'm a problem solver personally, but the world has a million critics, especially when you give them one of the most powerful devices ever created called a cell phone. Everybody's a damn critic. And so no matter what you say or what you do, somebody's judging you every second. And so you have to realize to tune that noise out or to disassociate yourself from that noise altogether. I've learned that evil is real. I think evil as a force in the world is a very real thing. And I think that people that don't see that are naive in their viewpoint. That's my judgment. Naive is dangerous. Naivety is dangerous. Again, evil is real. If you've ever seen war, you understand that how evil, just how evil people can be. And I think you have to understand that, first of all, that it exists so that you have the courage and the power to stand up to it when you recognize it. And I think if we look at these past few years, we've had catastrophic failure for the people who are supposed to be the protectors and the guardians of health to do their job, and even yet still today they're not standing up for what is right. What is right? What is right is the ability to make the decision. The person should be able to make the decision. We're not debating whether or not you think the vaccine is right or wrong, or I think it's right or wrong. We're debating the choice that you as an autonomous individual should be able to make with your God-given granted rights of body autonomy. And so the other lesson I've learned, and there's big debate over this too, is that guns are necessary. If evil is real, guns are necessary, because where there's evil, there's tyranny. Where there's tyranny, there's oppression. And if the bad guys have more firepower than the good guys, and the good guys can't stand up to tyranny when it's necessary. And so I know that's been a big debate in the public forum with a lot of mass shootings. And I think, as much as we can look at mass shootings and say they were wrong and that they were horrible events, I think more than anything else, I think that you could weaponize anything. A gun, it can be a weapon. A gun can be a form of protection. A gun can be a deterrent. But it's the person who holds the gun ultimately that makes the decision as to whether or not to pull the trigger. And whether that person was capable of accessing a gun legally, I don't think it would stop them from accessing one illegally or accessing some other form of weapon, to do their ill bidding. I mean, people have hijacked planes and cars and used clubs and baseball bats and any number of variety of inanimate objects to do their ill bidding. And so we can't criminalize all inanimate objects anyway. I think guns are necessary if we can recognize that evil exists. So at any rate, maybe tonight you glean just more inside of my brain and kind of more of what makes me tick and what makes me think. And maybe you learned something, and maybe you just heard something that you agreed with, and maybe you heard something that you disagreed with. Either way, I hope it was enjoyable for you. Thank you for spending your evening with me, and thank you for being there with me as I've made this journey over the past 50 years. You know, you're very precious to me, and I love you all. Have a great evening. Thanks for tuning in to the Dr. Osborne Zone. Don't forget to share, like, and subscribe for more content like this, and make sure you come back next Tuesday at 6 p.m. Central Standard Time and Thursday at noon 30 for more episodes.